You know, our view of God relates to everything we are and to everything that we do. Who you view God as, what you view God as relates to everything. If I were to make up my own God, he would be this, like this Hollywood depiction of this nice old man who kind of makes me laugh. Maybe he would be a God who was a butler-like character who kept me out of trouble and who met my every whim. The God I would make for myself would be kind, but he would be firm. He would overlook my sin as just, he's just being human. It's okay. He's just a human. You know, that sounds odd that we'd make up our own God. Not really. People do it every day. They like a designer God or create one called a higher power. Some like God to being one of rage or one of nitpicking. Others simply want a God who just oozes with love, and that's all. Let me ask you, do you worship the God of your imagination or the one who actually exists? Some God that you put in your mind, some God that you developed, or do you worship the God that really is? Sadly, our nation seems to worship a God that they've created instead of the God of the Bible. We've seen that recently all over the news. But God, as He is revealed in the Bible, doesn't look like the idols we carry around in our imaginations. As we look in the book of Romans, today I want to show you a God that most people try to avoid at all costs. This is a God of wrath and vengeance and judgment. This is the God who deals with sin, and He does it with severity. Why? Well, Romans 3 tells us that for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And sadly, we have seen in the last few days our Supreme Court has endorsed sin, a judicial abandonment of Christian standards. They have walked away from every Christian standard that there ever was in the judicial system. But that sin is not what has made God wrathful. It is simply the consequences of His wrath. Let me show you. First of all, humans reject God. Humans reject God. This is not a new phenomenon at all. People have always rejected God. Maybe you used to be in that category. The Apostle Paul describes the specifics of how humans go about rejecting God. Look what he says in verse 21. They dishonor God. Romans chapter 1, verse 21. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. You know, humans realize that there is a God. Look back at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. The best evidence of God outside of this book is nature. It's nature. It proves there is an intelligent design. The human body didn't just jump together and work in sequence out of the blue. It was designed. The sun, the moon, the stars prove the existence of God. The seasons show His handiwork. The millions of insects prove His creativity. The animals exhibit His ingenuity. Have you ever met an atheist? I have never met an atheist. I read about them. But you know, I'm not really sure they exist. I'm not really sure they exist. That they totally disbelieve in God. But many people do dishonor God. They know Him, but do not glorify Him as God. He is not important to them. They try to write Him off. They ignore Him. They disregard what He says. Even some Christians do that. Some believers are worse than that, though. Know Him, they proclaim Him, and yet they disobey His principles. I believe they will be held in stricter judgment for what they've done. Some people dishonor God. Secondly, Paul shows us they are ungrateful to God. He says in verse 21, nor were they thankful. They're ungrateful. They weren't thankful for what he'd given them. Have you ever done something for someone and they simply just didn't respond to you? They were ungrateful. It almost made you mad and negated what you did for them. For example, maybe you gave someone a wedding gift and they didn't even bother to write you a thank you note. You mumbled something under your breath about them as being an ingrate, and you say something like this, I hope it happens to you too. Hope nobody tells you thanks one day. But I wonder if God feels that way. When he does something amazing in our lives and we don't even bother to say thanks. I wonder if he feels that way. It seems that's where our nation is right now. He has blessed us and blessed us time and time again. And we're not grateful. As a church, are we grateful that God has seen fit to use us and bless our unity? As a family, are you grateful for what God has done in your children? Just like you, God likes to hear the words, thank you. Thank you. They were ungrateful to God. Thirdly, they act foolishly toward God. They act foolishly toward God. Again, verse 21, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts and were foolish. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Notice the phrases very well in those verses. They became futile in their thoughts. Their thoughts were a waste of time. Their thoughts were a waste of time. Do you know how many people there are who have a superb knowledge and waste it? I think of some PhDs who have devoted their entire life to a theory called evolution. They've spent countless hours and countless dollars on a theory of one man trying to prove that God doesn't exist. That's futile. On a more practical side, how many of your thoughts are a waste of time? If you've had thoughts this week of fear or of anxiety or of bitterness, they're a waste of time. They don't help you do anything. Then he says, their foolish hearts were darkened. This is a progression. Do you see it? They were futile in their thoughts, then their foolish hearts were darkened. Their thinking was foolish, and it caused their soul to be darkened, and to begin to spew out in their life. Because then he says in verse 22, they professed to be wise, yet they were fools. Paul uses the Greek term moros, which means this: mentally sluggish to the point of being morally worthless in heart and in character. It's where we get our term moron. They're morons. He says they became fools. They began to think foolishly, and then they acted foolishly, and the result is they were fools. They're morons. And so it seems to be plenteous today. There's morons walking around everywhere because they're acting like fools, that there is no God. But then they distort God and his creation. Look at verse 23. And they change the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. They don't like God or his design, so they want to change it. They begin to worship something that he created. And so Paul lists a couple of examples from creation. This progression has moved from a wholesale replacement of God. We don't like what you created. We don't like what you've done. We're going to change it. It still happens today. People look to their paycheck or portfolios for provision. They sacrifice a marriage or a children for some career. They ruin their lifestyle by adopting an activity that replaces God. Any activity. Humans long for a God who doesn't hold them accountable and who passively waits for us just to return. We think sometimes that God's this passive parent who just kind of says, okay, just go do what you want to do, have a good time, and he's going to let me return one day. There is nothing worse than a passive parent. And that's not God. God is not a passive father. He is actively seeking us to come back to him. But as we're about to see, he is the being who holds every single human accountable for sin. And the consequences of rejecting him in favor of sin are far graver than we can imagine. Let me ask you, have you rejected God in some area of your life? Have you rejected God? Have you pushed Him out of some area of your life? Maybe it's your marriage. You've left God out of your marriage or your dating life and you're suffering. Maybe it's your finances. You haven't followed God's principles and you're a financial hole. How about your parenting? You've let the kids do what they want. Or as some parents have done, they've caused their kids undue stress in some area. And you wonder what's wrong with your relationship with them now because they don't have any relationship with you. But let's not focus on America's wholesale rejection. I want us to focus on individual rejection because that's what's put our nation in the mess we're in right now. What area of your life have you rejected God? Look back at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and all unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Any sin we do says this, God, I reject you. God, I think I can do it better my way. God, I really don't care what you say. I'm going to try it this way. It's a rejection of God. So, before we begin to point our fingers at some people in black robes or people who are wearing rainbow flags, we need to look within and see our level of rejection in our personal walk with God. Here's what happens when humans reject God, and that's number 2. God rejects humans. Humans reject God, God rejects humans. We know that America has abandoned God. Even Iran and Russia mock the sin of America. But has God abandoned America? Listen to the precedent that was set, the precedent set by the nation of Israel thousands of years ago. I'm going to read you 4 verses. 2 Chronicles 36:16. But they continually mocked the messengers of God. They despised His words. They scoffed at His prophets until the wrath of God arose against His people until there was no remedy. Zechariah 7:12. They made their hearts like flint, like stone, so that they could not hear the law and the words which the Lord of hosts had sent by His Spirit through the former prophets. Therefore great wrath came from the Lord of hosts. Jeremiah 6:19. Hear, O earth, behold, I am bringing disaster on this people, the fruit of their plans, because they have not listened to my words. As for my law, they have rejected it also. One more, Micah 3:4. Then they will cry out to the Lord, but He will not answer them. Instead, He will hide His face from them at that time, because they have practiced evil deeds. Does that sound like America? You see, God's mercy does have a limit. The Old Testament proves that. God's not going to keep blessing people who curse Him. He's just not going to do it. He will not keep blessing nations who abandon Him. America is no longer, and hasn't been for a long time, a Christian nation. So what does God do when He can't take it no more? How does God respond? This gives us a glimpse when He said these 3 things. Jesus said this, whoever listens to you, He's talking to the Father, listens to me. Whoever rejects you rejects me, and whoever rejects me rejects the one who sent me. In John 12, He says this, he who rejects me and does not receive my sayings has one who judges him. The word I spoke is what will judge him in the last day. And in Matthew 10, Jesus said, whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who's in heaven. People reject Christ because they love their sin. And they hate to have it exposed by God's light. People don't want God interfering with what they consider a good time, and they don't believe the warnings of Scripture that they're under God's judgment now, and they will face it for all of eternity when they die if they haven't accepted Christ. People think that they're basically good. Did you find that in life? People think they're pretty good people. I'm basically a good guy. I don't do this, I don't do that. And they think that God's just going to overlook their thoughts. They think that God is so loving and so kind that He's just going to overlook their sins and say, it's okay, come on into heaven anyway. And so they don't repent of their sin. And they begin to practice that sin, any sin, as a lifestyle. I fully believe last month's Supreme Court ruling in favor of gay marriage is evidence that God has abandoned America. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote this after the decision. He said, the majority opinion is at odds not only with the Constitution, but with the principles upon which our nation were built. Pastor Bob Russell put it this way. He said, the endorsement of same-sex marriage dramatically underscores the moral freefall that has been taking place in our country. Behavior that is labeled detestable in the Bible and was deemed illegal just a few decades ago is now held as loving and healthy. Who's changed? God or culture? Isaiah 5:20 says this, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. The arrogant decision by the Supreme Court to override the votes of the people in the 31 states demonstrates that the constitutional republic that was established in 1789 is no longer functioning as intended. Justice Antonin Scalia wrote this in his dissenting opinion. Quote, a system of government that makes the people subordinate to a committee of 9 unelected lawyers does not deserve to be called a democracy. That's pretty strong. The court's endorsement of same-sex marriage will pave the way to future persecution of those who don't approve it. Justice Thomas also wrote this, quote, in our society, marriage is not simply a governmental institution, it's a religious institution as well. He said, today's decision might change the former, but it cannot change the latter. It appears all but inevitable that the two will come into conflict, particularly as individuals and churches are confronted with demands to participate in and endorse civil marriages between same-sex couples. Dr. Russell continues, he says, only a simpleton will be naive enough to believe that this battle is over. Soon to follow will be an all-out assault on Christians who refuse to violate their biblical convictions. He says this, Christian colleges that refuse to add gay staff members will become ineligible for government loans. Small businesses that don't participate in same-sex marriage ceremonies will be fined and owners will be required to attend sensitivity classes. Churches that refuse to allow gay marriages in their building will be stripped of tax exemptions and benefits. Ministers who dare speak out against homosexual behavior will be charged with hate speech and fined, perhaps even imprisoned. Our social and legal landscape has dramatically changed. You and I are living in a time unprecedented, like no one has ever seen in this nation or in the world. I think it's clear. God has turned His back on America. R.C. Sproul, in his commentary on Romans, speaks on what he calls judicial abandonment. Judicial abandonment, which is an explanation of just exactly how God justly judges people. Here's what he says. The worst thing that can happen to sinners is to be allowed to go on sinning without any divine restraints. Welcome to the United States. Just do what you want to do. It's okay. There's no restraints. He says at the end of the New Testament in the book of Revelation, the description of the last judgment is set forth, and here's what it says. God says this, he who is unjust, let him be unjust still. He who is filthy, let him be filthy still. God gives people over to what they want. He abandons them to their sinful impulses and removes His restraints, saying in essence, if you want to sin, go ahead. He gives us free will to choose. And God, in dispensing His judgment, abandons the impenitent sinner forever. And in here in the book of Romans, since by nature we repress the truth, God delivers us over to our sin. Romans is unapologetic about this concept of judicial abandonment, arguing that it is right and it's just for God Himself to abandon sinners to the desires of their lust and their sin, thus allowing them to run, not walk, to run to hell. God's grace is removed, the floodgates are open, and without His divine restraint, we as sinners will forever lose our love for God and will choose hell without exception. Paul tells us in Romans, it's right for God to do this. It's God's righteous judgment on the wicked. Judicial abandonment. He's the judge, and the judge is abandoning the sin. Look carefully and compare to America in 2015. We see another sequence of threes in these verses emphasizing graver implications each time. And I want you to note the specific sin in each example and how each one leads to the next sin. It says this, God gave the sinners up, in the first two. And then it says, God gave them over. He cannot tolerate sin. We know that about God. That's a very clear premise of who God is. And so He abandons humans to let them do their own thing. How? Well, He shows us in verse 24, with uncleanness. Look what He says in verse 24. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness, in the lusts of their heart, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. Today's word for uncleanness might be contaminated or infected. Would you want a surgeon to use infected or contaminated tools as he cuts into you? I doubt it. You want that surgeon to throw those things away and to get something that's clean, that's pure. Why do we expect God to be any different? Why would God use something that's unclean? He has turned them over to contamination. And God's purpose for turning people over to their impurity is simply this, and I want you to get this. It's not because He's mean. It's not because He's mad at people. It's because it is redemptive. And here's what I mean by that. God sometimes allows humans to wallow in their own filth so they can realize they want a better life. He sometimes allows us just to wallow in our own filth. And so we'll wake up and realize, this is not what I want. It's the prodigal son who was eating what the pigs were eating. And he woke up one day and realized, hey, my father has something better for me. We used to have a German shepherd named Rex. We had a field close to the house and there were horses in it. And Rex loved to go to the horse field and just lay and wallow in horse manure. I don't know why he did that. I mean, he stunk to high heaven. He'd come back to the house and he'd want us to love all over him and pet him, and it's everybody, ooh, Rex, get away. And eventually, as Rex got older, he quit doing that. I think he realized we were rejecting him. But you know, sometimes God just allows us to wallow in our own filth and to keep on sinning until we begin to realize, hey, my Father has something better for me. It's redemptive. And idolaters contaminate themselves by worshiping, he says, the creature rather than the Creator. Times and cultures have changed since this was written, but the heart of humanity has not changed. Few people in our culture bow before a carved piece of wood or stone, but many trust possessions instead of the provider. Many look to drugs or alcohol or sex or shopping or work or pornography or food and a host of other coping behaviors rather than seeking the Creator. He says they've changed the image, and so they daily exchange the truth for a lie, and they make themselves filthy in the process, unclean, contaminated. Secondly, God turns them over to vile passions, it says in verse 26. Vile passions. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. For even their women exchange the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another. Men with men, committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. And I'm going to get very specific with you. This is moving to PG-13. Who created, you can answer this out loud, who created sex? God did. We understand that. God created it for a purpose. He created it for pleasure and for honor. Listen carefully. Anytime sex is taken out of the context in which God created it, it becomes a sin. Anytime. Premarital, it's a sin. Extramarital, it's a sin. Homosexuality, it's a sin. Pedophilia, it's a sin. We believe it's all sins because it's out of the context of marriage. Now, we've redefined marriage. We haven't, but our country has. And so now we've got an argument to say, well, we're married now, it's okay. We're married now, we can practice what we want to do. We've got to be very careful with that. That's the new argument that's coming. But you may say something like this: I don't care what people do in their bedrooms as long as they don't bother me. Maybe you've said that. I don't care what you do in your bedroom as long as you don't bother me. Do we really want to teach our children that philosophy? God cares about what people do in the bedroom because He created sex.
Looking for a great eating experience? Then you need to come over to Twister's. Twister's is a locally owned diner that simply has it all. From salads to burgers, blue plate specials, and a terrific kids menu, Twister's is sure to please any member of your family. Twister's also has the best ice cream you'll find. From a simple cone to specialty sundaes, Mayfield soft serve is a treat anytime. Dine in or just drive through. Twister's is an experience you don't want to miss, whether you're looking for a great meal or just to satisfy that sweet tooth. Twister's Diner, just a good place.